welcome back to Cryptid Mysterious. Alright guys, we got a little bit of a treat in today's episode. I wasn't originally going to do this, but the first story that I read was quite short. So we're going to have a triple story episode coming right at you. Before we get into it, I'd appreciate you hitting that subscribe button for me, and I really do thank everyone who has smashed that button already. This channel has taken off, and it's kind of hard to believe, but I do appreciate it. It's an inspiration, and it makes me love what I do even more. Thanks, everyone. Let's get into today's first of 3 Bigfoot encounters. This one comes to us from Susan Patterson, who was on a hike in the Rocky Mountain National Park with her girlfriends. Here's her story. On the day I had my sighting, my girlfriends and I had decided to take a hike up to the fire lookout station atop Shadow Mountain. The hike began from the Grand Lake entrance area. We soon found ourselves wrapping around the lake with Shadow Mountain in full view. In hindsight, I would have highly recommended wearing bug spray when walking near the lake. It was something that we did not have that day, and let me tell you, did we pay for it. The mosquitoes were absolutely brutal. At times, we were close to the water's edge. Once we were clear of the area, we started heading directly towards the mountain itself and its ascending trail. By the time we were midway up the mountain trail, we'd already seen a bear and several deer, as well as many chipmunks and what I believe was a mink or something of that sort. Once you're beyond the midway point, the trail becomes quite steep. There were a lot of trees on the trail that day, which made things quite difficult for us. Nevertheless, we had made it to the top. We approached the lookout with relief, but were disappointed. To our dismay, the tower's staircase was locked, keeping us from climbing up into it. Basically, it's a fairly short tower made from stone, with painted brown logs forming a deck base on the top, upon which a small hut-like structure is attached to it. So we sat up there for about an hour or two, enjoying the views from every side of the mountain. It was actually breathtaking, and I would highly recommend it to anyone with a good pair of legs. The trees in this area are predominantly some type of narrow-growing pines, which I believe are spruce. A fair amount of them are dead, which creates a type of screen to the eyes as you're peering about on the trail. We'd actually seen bears and deer walking about in this timber screening as we were on our way up to the lookout station. It gave the appearance of something walking behind a stockade fence, with every other slat removed. What I'm trying to do here is set the stage for you visually for what we were about to see on our descent from Shadow Mountain. The 3 of us had just passed the steepest section as we're making our way down the slope. It was right about that time when my girlfriend Trisha said, "Look guys, another bear down there." As we all turned our heads to look, I think Trisha realized at the same time that we all did, that this was not a bear. It was a Bigfoot. At first glance, this was an easy mistake to make because of the broken field of vision created by all the dead gray trees. We were quite a bit higher than this creature that was walking through the trees down and away off to our right. We weren't making any noise other than walking. Otherwise, I'm sure it would have spied us out, but it didn't. This Bigfoot was on a mission because it didn't stop for a second as it was walking. When we first saw it, I believe we were maybe 300 or 400 feet away from it, and we were able to get some fairly good looks at it as it traversed the slope. The only way it could have seen us is if it were to look up and over its left shoulder, which thankfully it didn't. At that point, we were on the trail and there was really nowhere to hide. So we just quietly stood our ground and watched. This thing was moving very quickly through the tightly packed pines, and we could see the treetops rocking back and forth as it parted them, making its way through using its arms and hands to clear the path. I would say that most of the trees in here were between, I'd say, 12 and 25 feet tall. The Bigfoot measured up as being pretty dang tall in our estimation. It was incredible to see. And no, it wasn't a man in a monkey suit. One of the most bothersome things about having a sighting like this is the after effect of how you're received by your peers, having told them of your experience. Speaking for myself, I was high as a kite, metaphorically, for weeks after the sighting, and anxious to tell everyone and anyone what I had seen. But those euphoric feelings soon dwindled away as I saw and heard the reactions of those with whom I spoke. It's really a crying shame that people choose to be so ignorant about these things. However, that's coming from someone's perspective who had just seen one. I'm not sure how I would have reacted had you told me of your experience, but I'd like to think that I would have responded in a better way than most. And now for our second encounter of the day. This was not planned. This was completely coincidental. But our second encounter is just across the valley, like a 45-minute drive from where the last encounter took place. It was meant to be. This one comes to us from Brandon Richards, a resident of Colorado. My friend Anthony and I had planned to spend 5 days backpacking and camping in the Grand Teton National Park. Is that how you say it? Teton? 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 Drop in the comments if you know how to pronounce that word. Sorry, I'm not familiar with that side of the country. You should get over there. Do some exploring. Find me one of these big feet. Well, I'm done rambling. During the course of the first 3 days, we'd been working our way into and through a variety of locations within the park. It was on the 4th day that we found ourselves sitting at a higher elevation overlooking Lake Solitude below us in the valley. With the western slope of Grand Teton, I'm just going to call it Teton for the sake of the story, facing us in the distance. From our vantage point, which was considerable, both of the slopes descending down to the lake were in view. They were sporadically covered with large swaths of pine trees. This was a vast panoramic view, which I'm attempting to paint for the mind's eye, just so you can better understand what I'm speaking about. When you see something in the distance here, it's extremely difficult to judge just how far that distance is. Everything is much further away than it appears, a fact which becomes more than evident once you begin hiking towards what you're seeing. We were perched on this low mountainside, overlooking what I just described to you, taking in the view. The two of us each carried a good pair of field glasses, which we had not needed up until the moment of Anthony's focus fixated on something below us. He reached into his backpack for his binoculars and raised them up to his eyes, not saying a word. As he began looking intently at what appeared to be a very specific location, he told me to grab my binoculars and focus in on what he was looking at. I said to Anthony, "What do you see?" He responded, "Just grab your glasses and look between those two groups of trees down there to the right." I did as he said, and started to scan the area of which he spoke, when suddenly I said, "It's a damn Bigfoot." Anthony said, "I know. I just wanted to hear what you would say to confirm what I already thought." There was no doubt about it. The two of us now had our lenses fixed clearly on a large black beast walking on 2 legs in and out of the trees on the slope well below us. The distance could have been at the very least a mile or more. However, with the 20 by 50 binoculars, we had an extremely good field of view, which included the Bigfoot and its activities. Now, It's not that I need to explain my somewhat instantaneous response of it being a Bigfoot, but it was painfully obvious what we were seeing. First of all, there's never anyone seen hiking or hunting in these parts dressed from head to toe in black, wearing no shoes or boots. Secondly, there would be under no circumstances anyone in this area without a backpack and supplies just casually sauntering around in the wilderness. Third, there's literally and figuratively nobody out here, especially where we were. In the 3 days prior, we had sighted a group of 3 individuals that were more than likely a half a mile away from us coming off a ridge. And that was it as far as human contact is concerned. As we sat watching the Bigfoot walking through our lenses, it suddenly stopped. As it was facing one of the pines, it began to do something with its arms extended. It was using its hands in a way which made it appear as though it was working on or picking at the side of the pine. We watched him doing this for over a half an hour. Occasionally, we'd see the beast crouch or bend down to the ground, where it appeared to be picking up something that had fallen to the ground. The beast would then follow this action by putting its hand to its face or mouth. I don't need to tell you that at this distance, we couldn't see any details. After the creature had spent a considerable amount of time by the side of this tree, it started to move around, in and out of our field of vision. It appeared to be looking at some other trees that were near it. My recollection is that we had lost sight of it for about 45 minutes when it emerged from the trees and started walking along the slope, heading away from us and toward Lake Solitude. Now, just to settle the score with those of you who think that people who see such a thing are suffering from some kind of delusional disorder, this was like looking at a jet black Frankenstein walking in the middle of nowhere. Even at the distance from which we were watching, the creature walked with the long arm swings and the deliberately lengthy strides. These dramatic movements were more than obvious to the eye, but this thing was not putting on a show for anyone to see. We were more than a mile away watching it from an elevation of well over 1,000 feet or more. It had no idea that it was being watched by anyone or anything. With all the various stories that the two of us and so many others have heard about these things through the years, this sighting had completely sealed the deal for Anthony and I. Bigfoot is, in fact, the real deal. Well, yeah, you can't really talk someone out of believing what they saw. Just because you haven't seen one yourself doesn't mean they're not real. I don't understand why people are so dogmatic about this subject. I know it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because they haven't been acknowledged officially by the powers that be, but like he said, he saw it, and Bigfoot is in fact the real deal. You're not going to tell him otherwise. Let's jump into our third story of today's episode. This one comes to us from John and Barbara Small, residents of Pennsylvania. Here's their story. My wife and I had purchased a house that was listed as for sale by owner in the western Pennsylvania area. It was an all-cash deal with a fast closing. When you went to look at the house, the couple who were living there had a beat-up little shack in the backyard. The main house was so nice I couldn't believe they had this piece of garbage building in the backyard. It was a painted red barn-looking thing, and it had been repaired 10 times over with chewing gum and Band-Aids. It was, however, being actively used as a hen house. The access door on the top of the house looked like it was hanging by a thread. It was held shut by a piece of clothesline that was nailed to the wood on one end and wrapped around a boat cleat on the other. Along one side of this shack, the upper half of the exterior sheathing had been removed, exposing the stud wall. This was covered now in chicken wire that had been stapled in place. The bottom side of this same wall had a hole cut in it for some of the hens to go in and out. Along the outside edge was a pen made of pressure-treated 4x4 lumber and chicken wire. It was the most ramshackle junk box setup I'd ever seen. 2 weeks before we closed the deal, they asked my wife and I if we wanted them to leave the chickens for us. And we said, no thanks, and we left after that. At the closing table in the attorney's office, we had asked them during some small talk how they made out with the removal of the chickens. John, the husband, said, "Thank God we got rid of them at the last minute, only yesterday afternoon." The following day, my wife and I were over there painting the interior of the house, and my friend Lou was prepping the bathroom for a new tile job. Less than 6 days later, we'd moved in. It was on the evening of April 26, 2015, 3 days after we moved in, that all hell broke loose. I remember the exact date because we had just collaborated with my wife's first birthday in the new home on the 25th. During the last stages of twilight, after the sun had already set for the day, I stepped out of the back door onto the patio, having just come home from work. All of the following things that I'm about to say to you virtually happened at the same time. I stepped out of the back door. My eyes were immediately drawn to the rope lock on the hen house. It was unraveled, leaving the door open on the now empty coop. As I was looking at this open door, I'd pulled the door shut hard behind me, quite loudly, when without warning, a Bigfoot launched outward from inside of the coop. He jumped out in what I would call a Superman leap, straight through the chicken wire, which was now wrapped around him as he landed on the ground. He was gigantic and came flying out in full force, completely horizontal to the ground, landing on all fours, maybe 25 feet from the coop. With one swift movement, he stood to his feet, flinging both arms into the air, throwing the wire off his body. He turned, snarled at me, and then literally launched himself into the woods behind our home in what was maybe 3 or 4 consecutive leaps. I wouldn't call them steps because of the amount of ground he covered in these 3 movements of his legs was insane. All of this had happened so quickly that I didn't even have time to think about what was unfolding before my own eyes. It momentarily felt like my heart had actually stopped and I wasn't breathing. If he had wanted to get me, I would have been dead meat for sure. But it seemed like I had just surprised the monster and it just wanted to get the heck out of our yard. I'd never in my life been that close to anything remotely as large as this thing. It became immediately obvious to me that it was familiar with the smell and location of this house, which did, by the way, stink like chicken shit. And I was left wondering if it hadn't been here before. When he stood up in front of me, he looked like one giant cube of an animal. It reminded me of the old Hulk TV show when Bill, what's his name, transformed into that monster. The Bigfoot was totally ripped up in every sense of the word, being just muscle upon muscle. He had the most evil-looking facial grimace that you could ever imagine. When he growled at me, his upper lip somewhat receded as he showed me his teeth. As he did this, his facial skin kind of crunched up, forming a large layer of wrinkles up to his eyes, which were completely black, by the way. I could see that the underlying skin was dark gray in color. Initially, I'd thought that he was completely covered in hair, but he wasn't. He did have somewhat of what I'll call a beard, and there was actually quite a bit of hair on his face, with the exception of the area on both sides of his nose. To me, his ears seemed too small for his head, and they were flushed to the sides as well. My wife, who works in a local hospital until 11 p.m., could not believe what I told her when she came home. Quite frankly, who could blame her? It was the craziest and most frightening event of my life to date, and I hope that I never have to endure it again. Well, guys, that's where his story comes to an end. I'm a little surprised that is where it comes to an end, because that was back in 2015, and you would think, well, I suppose since the chickens are gone, the Bigfoot wouldn't have any real interest in coming back. Maybe the Bigfoot realized that there were new owners of the house, new occupants, and no chickens. So I suppose that would be the end of that activity, if there's obviously, nothing to bait them in. So it seems he got his wish. Bigfoot never came around again. I wonder if they continued to live in the house or if they put it back on the market for sale by owner all over again. We may never know, but cool story nonetheless. Well, if you've had an encounter with any of these creatures, or anything mysterious for that matter, I'd love to hear about it. Drop me an email at cryptidmysterious@gmail.com. Don't forget to let me know what you think about today's episode. I definitely do enjoy hearing what you all think of these stories, and I also enjoy some good constructive criticism. If there's anything regarding the video that I should be improving on, drop her in the comments. I'm open to hearing it. I'm trying to get better every time I do these for y'all. I do enjoy doing this, and why the heck not try to get better at it. All that said, I appreciate y'all hanging out. I will see you in the next one.